and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Trump calls Zelenskyy a dictator after refusing to hold elections, accusing him of doing a terrible job. It's after Zelenskyy responded to Trump's comments that Ukraine could have settled the war with Russia easily and criticized the US president of being trapped in a disinformation bubble. Meanwhile, Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg arrives in Kyiv to discuss security guarantees as he promises to sit and listen to Ukraine. And Hamas says it will hand over the bodies of 4 hostages on Thursday, including 2 children taken by the group on the 7th of October. To our top story, and Donald Trump has hit out at President Zelenskyy, accusing him of being a dictator without elections. Writing on Truth Social, the president said, modestly successful comedian Volodymyr Zelenskyy talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that could not be won, that never had to be started, but a war that he, without the US and Trump, will never be able to settle. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back. On top of this, Zelenskyy admits that half of the money we sent him is missing. He refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections, Zelenskyy better move fast, or he is not going to have a country left. It comes after Zelenskyy accused Trump of being trapped in a disinformation bubble after Trump suggested Ukraine could have settled the war with Russia easily. We can now go live to Washington to speak to our correspondent, Nick Harper. Nick, good evening to you. These two seem to be aiming daily blows at one another. A dictator, a modestly successful comedian. Trump also implies US money donated to Ukraine has actually gone missing. Some pretty harsh words being used by Trump here.
Yeah, very harsh words, a real litany of criticism here from the US president. And we've seen that, as you said, being ramped up over the course of the last few days. A number of patently false accusations in there, including Zelenskyy being a dictator, despite being elected in what have been seen as free and fair elections, saying that he has done a terrible job, and also pressuring for that peace deal, saying that he better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. That accusation as well, that billions of US dollars of funding have gone missing during the 3 years of conflict. And the problem for Zelenskyy, for European allies and many of Donald Trump's critics, is this feeling that here the US president is quite simply parroting language that we've seen from the Kremlin, propaganda against Ukraine. So significant concerns about this latest social media post from the US president.
Yes, indeed, Nick. Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy, is in Kyiv right now to meet Zelenskyy. That's going to be a bit of an awkward sort of meeting for him, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is tough timing for Keith Kellogg, who is there in the country trying to move things forward, trying to also reassure Ukraine, despite this criticism coming from the White House. And also, it comes off the back of those attacks from the US president, including on Tuesday, those suggestions that negotiations had been possible. Quite simply, at any point during the last 3 years, Donald Trump seemed to be suggesting, saying that even a half-baked negotiator could have solved it. Donald Trump also suggesting that he could have negotiated a peace deal before the war began and been able to do so without the loss of life, without the loss of land. Keith Kellogg's job certainly made much harder by that criticism on Tuesday, but also this latest social media post.
Nick, earlier today, Putin said no one is excluding Ukraine and insists he'll be happy to meet Donald Trump. Are these some positive signals that Ukraine and Europe will be part of future negotiations?
Well, potentially, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that what we're seeing from European leaders, even from US lawmakers, some within Donald Trump's own party, is that warning that quite simply the Russian president cannot be trusted. And even though we're seeing those warm words, those suggestions that Ukraine will be included, that may not become the case. We're seeing similar language from the US top officials, though. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, both saying that so far this is not a betrayal of Ukraine for excluding them at this point, and also trying to make it clear that those talks that were held between top US and Russian officials in Riyadh was really more about normalizing US-Russia relations, to get them on a good footing before the proper peace negotiations begin. But of course, there has been that worry from Europe and from Kyiv that they did not have a seat at the table, that they were not part of even those initial negotiations.
Trump also spoke about his past conversations with President Putin before the invasion of Ukraine. It's easy to understand why critics are accusing him of favouring Russia, and like you mentioned with that Truth Social post, Nick.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think if we look at this in the context of how US relations with Ukraine and Russia have changed over the course of the last month, since Joe Biden left office and since Donald Trump came into office, really, it's been a complete 180. Ukraine was considered an ally. The US was providing funding, support, military equipment to the country, while at the same time keeping Russia at arm's length. There were sanctions in place. It was a real cold-shouldered type of arrangement, trying to turn Russia into a pariah nation as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. But what we've seen under Donald Trump is really a switch of those roles. It is now President Zelenskyy who is being kept at arm's length, while Russia quite literally has a seat at the table, with those peace negotiations now having begun between the US and Russia. And that complete change, I think, has worried many of those officials in Europe, but it has fueled critics of Donald Trump who are using his own words, where he has talked very warmly about the Russian leader in the past, saying that he has done a good job, while at the same time saying that the Ukrainian leader has done a terrible job. And there is that concern that Donald Trump, who is known to like strongmen, who is known to like the Russian leader, is now cozying up to him at the expense of Ukraine.
Nick Harper in Washington, thank you so much. Trump's latest Truth Social comments come after President Zelenskyy accused President Trump of being trapped in a disinformation bubble. The Ukrainian leader was responding to Trump's words that Ukraine could have settled the war with Russia very easily. He also dismissed claims about his approval ratings and calls to replace him, claiming Russia was responsible for the spread of misinformation. Here's exactly what he had to say.
We have seen this disinformation. We understand that it comes from Russia. We understand that. And we have evidence that these numbers are being discussed between America and Russia. So unfortunately, President Trump, who we have great respect for as the leader of the American people, whom we respect very much, who supports us constantly.
We can now speak to Ukrainian MP Yevheniia Kravchuk. Yevheniia, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Zelenskyy is clearly Zelenskyy is clearly disappointed by President Trump's comments, and in the last hour, Trump has called him a dictator in this scathing post on Truth Social. Do you think this is more disinformation coming out of the White House? What's your reaction?
Indeed, not just Zelenskyy, but Ukrainian people are a bit surprised with this reaction or these comments coming from the Trump administration and President Trump himself, because in fact, the approval ratings of President Zelenskyy are on the same level the full-scale invasion, the biggest conflict on European continent now for 3 years, and the war for 11 years in Ukraine. It is quite difficult to understand. To my mind, it might be some sort of trying to influence the, as Trump thinks, the weaker side, Ukraine, which is, a small country, less population, and actually a victim in this war of aggression, and that would be easier and faster to end the war. But Ukraine hadn't give in into ultimatums in 2022, in February 2022, and in 2025 we have our own military production. We had 800,000 people in the army. We have a running economy, and it will not give into ultimatums as well. And of course, Ukraine love to have elections. Ukrainian people love to go to elections and elect new people into the government. And actually, if you look on Russia, for 25 years, when Putin was a dictator and a ruler or whatever, on head of Russian state, Ukraine had 6 presidents change. So 25 years in Russia, just one Putin, not changing, and in Ukraine, 6 presidents had been changed. And of course, we will hold elections when it will be in normal circumstances, not drones flying around, not missiles flying on our heads, and of course not Russia on our borders wanting to invade a sovereign state.
Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, has actually arrived in Kyiv today. Zelenskyy has suggested Kellogg should ask locals about the war and what they make of Trump's comments. After Trump's comments, this must be a pretty awkward meeting for the two men. How do you think these talks are going?
Well, I've just seen information that General Kellogg had met the head of the office of President Zelenskyy so far, and I think that was a good conversation. So I didn't see any of the official comments after the meeting of actual President Zelenskyy and General Kellogg. But as I know, it's not just a one-day trip, so it will be a few days. And I really hope that General Kellogg will not just spend his time in governmental buildings in Kyiv, but also will speak to people, or maybe will go to the front line and see the men and women fighting on the front and what they think about the ultimatums and unjust peace. I mean, we've been paying with blood for our sovereignty, and we're not just going to give in just so easily.
Zelenskyy announced he was postponing his visit to Saudi Arabia yesterday, claiming he wouldn't give legitimacy to the US-Russia meeting. But I want to ask you, where does this leave Ukraine and Europe at the negotiation table?
Well, first of all, we do have a good response from European leaders, and you might have seen that President Macron had just invited some leaders into Paris, and he's holding another summit with different countries also on the European continent, but also Canada, for example. And we do feel support, and I think that there will be a next package of sanctions from European Union next week to the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion, but also next package in the military aid. And I think Europe is changing and actually understanding that it has to be European countries who will be responsible for the security on the European continent, not just constantly relying on the United States. As you said about the trip, canceled trip, this trip will be held, but in March. So the next date set up will be March 10th. But before that, President Zelenskyy, together with his wife, was in United Arab Emirates and had some very good meetings, and also economical cooperation will to come. But also he held a meeting with the President Erdogan in Turkey. And Turkey is actually a very strong supporter of the sovereignty of Ukraine, saying that internationally recognized borders should be recognized.
Yevheniia Kravchuk, Ukrainian MP, I appreciate your thoughts tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's get the Russian side of things with John S. Kavulich, a senior editor for outcome modelling analysis at Issue Insight. John, good evening to you. We have been discussing Trump's comments that Ukraine could have settled the war with Russia easily. And he has hit out at Zelenskyy, calling him a dictator in this scathing post on Truth Social. The row between the US and Ukraine appears to be deepening.
Very much so. You know, this, for everyone watching this unfold, it's almost like being in the production room of a reality show, where you're watching in real time the characters develop their scripts and then say what they're going to say. And it's important and it's instructive to remember with President Trump that he, during his first term, and somewhat thus far during the month into his second term, he often separated himself from his own government. He would say, I have a great relationship with President Xi of China, but my government is sanctioning them. I have a great relationship with President Kim of North Korea, my government's sanctioning. And with President Putin, he would say, I have a great relationship with President Putin, but it's my government. And during the first Trump administration, no U.S. administration had sanctioned Russia more than the Trump administration. So he tries to separate all of this. And so it's important to remember that, one, he is, very good and very adept at separating himself from what the government does to leave room for conversation. And then what we're seeing with what he's doing vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the meetings in Saudi Arabia, is everyone, I think, is overanalyzing and talking about, a just and lasting peace. President Trump is not interested in a just and lasting peace. He's interested in a ceasefire. And so that's what his primary goal in interacting with President Putin is. He knows that President Putin is going to do what he wants to do a year from now, 2 years from now, or as long as he's president. And he also realizes that he can't really do much about that. And for President Zelenskyy, that's really tough to swallow, because President Zelenskyy wants something that has permanence, that will live past his term in office. So we have these, competing narratives. And unfortunately for Ukraine, everything is basically going to go the way the United States directs it.
Lavrov has praised Trump for his stance on NATO after Trump accused the previous US government for supporting Ukraine's bid to join the military alliance. Does Russia feel like it's won this particular battle by having Trump and the US supports right now?
Absolutely. The government of the Russian Federation is feeling very confident because President Trump is very, very good at optics, and optics are important to him. The moment, the television moment, the verbal moment. And so for the Russian Federation, what did they get? They got the U.S. Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister Lavrov meeting in Saudi Arabia. Now, as someone who has been looking and a part of what has happened since February 24th of 2022, we had, during the Biden administration, we had the G7 meetings, but particularly we had the G20 meetings where Russia remained a partner. And at those G20 meetings, Indonesia, India, in Brazil, we had the U.S. Secretary of State doing everything possible to avoid discussing anything with Lavrov. And now we have the U.S. Secretary of State within the first 30 days of the Trump administration saying, we've got other issues with Russia. Now, for Europe and for Ukraine, they don't look at it that you can pull it all apart. It's Ukraine's a part of everything. But for Trump, he's looking, where can he win in the relationship with Russia? Where can he chalk some things up that people will say, this is the Trump legacy? And so that's why you're seeing what he's doing in a very public way, and now picking the fight, or Zelenskyy picking the fight, because it's important to remember that President Zelenskyy during the last 3 years has insulted just about every head of state and head of government that has provided support to Ukraine, and he continues to do it. With President Trump, that's not really a good idea. And so you're the Russian Federation. You're feeling really good right now because you haven't really done anything. You haven't stopped bombing. You haven't stopped killing, but you are talking to the President of the United States.
The US has told Europe it needs to spend more on defence. This has been a big thing. Well, as we've been discussing, the EU appears to be sidelined from these peace talks aimed at ending Russia's war in Ukraine. My big question to you is, can Europe really survive without America's support, especially NATO?
It can. It just has to recalibrate. President Trump, when he looks at the European Union, he looks at it as an opportunity to disassemble it. And so Ursula von der Leyen, Dr. von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, in essence, the administrator, she views herself as a head of state, head of government for the 27 member countries. President Trump views her as an administrator. He wants to be dealing with the heads of state and heads of government of the 27 members. And so that makes it very, very difficult because the European Union requires for most issues unanimity. And President Trump knows that. So he just has to pick off one to really cause some issues. And right now he has Hungary, he has Slovakia, and he has some others that are more quiet that really don't want as much attention placed on Ukraine as there is. And the financing, do they have the money? Yes. But just like the United States, President Trump has said, you need to be north of 2%, you need to be 3%, you need to be 4%, you need to be 5%. The United States will not be spending 5% because there are too many other issues, social issues, infrastructure, education, healthcare, that taxpayers want to see. The same goes within Europe. So they're not going to be able to coalesce that kind of money to replace the United States. But can NATO survive with a lessened United States? Absolutely. The challenge with NATO, and this is one of the reasons why President Zelenskyy has never been able to, A, have Ukraine become a member of NATO, and then B, have NATO troops in Ukraine, is because no NATO member wanted to test what is referred to as Article 5. And Article 5 is not a requirement, but it is a component of the agreement that says that an attack on one means that the other members will then determine what they want to do, if they want to do anything, to help that particular member. And so no NATO member wanted to test the fact that if something happened in Ukraine where the Russian armed forces of the Russian Federation hit at NATO, would NATO really want to fight back? So no one wanted to test the proposition. That was bad for President Zelenskyy. And now with the European Union trying to figure out what they're going to do with money and with respect to whether they're going to have a collective defense budget or allow members to spend more. We've got a German election coming up in 4 days. We've got a Polish election coming up in May. We've got other elections throughout the 27 members of the European Union coming along. NATO being pushed to spend more. And then President Trump saying, I want this wrapped up. And for President Zelenskyy, he knows that President Trump is interested in a ceasefire. NATO knows that. The European Union knows that. They're not happy about it because it's what's going to satisfy him short term. But that's basically where we are. And I don't think we're going to move from the focus being on the ceasefire as opposed to a longer-term resolution of the Russia-Ukraine issue.
John S. Kavulich, it's been absolutely fascinating to speak to you this evening. Thank you so much for joining me, Senior Editor for Outcome Modelling Analysis at Issue Insight. Thank you once again.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. A British journalist has gone missing in Brazil, according to the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. 32-year-old Charlotte Alice Pete worked for Al Jazeera and The Times, told a friend she was in Sao Paulo on the 8th of February but was planning to visit Rio de Janeiro before she did disappear. The ACIE is calling on authorities to step up the search to find her. The rapper A$AP Rocky has been found not guilty of firing a gun at his former friend. A jury in Los Angeles acquitted the musician who denied the charges after a 3-week trial. Fans of the hip-hop performer and his partner, the singer Rihanna, screamed and cried after the verdict. Pope Francis has spent a 5th night in hospital, according to the Vatican. The pontiff has the onset of double pneumonia after being admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on the 14th of February. The infection can inflame and scar both lungs and makes breathing more difficult. And the British tennis player Emma Raducanu has thanked fans for their support after dealing with a man who exhibited fixated behaviour at the Dubai Tennis Championships. According to the WTA, Raducanu was approached by the man in a public area on Monday night and later ejected from the stadium. Writing on Instagram, Raducanu said, "Difficult day yesterday, but I'll be okay and proud of how I came back and competed, despite what happened at the start of the match." To Israel now, and Hamas says they will release the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages on Thursday. The group's negotiator says it will also release 6 living hostages on Saturday, double the number originally planned. In exchange, Israel will free all women and anyone under the age of 19 who has been arrested since last October. We can now go live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent Giles Gibson, who's been following this story. Giles, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. This exchange will include the bodies of 2 of the youngest people held by the group. Tell us who they are and what their family have said about the announcement.
Well, Hamas is saying that 3 out of the 4 are Sheri Bibas and her 2 young children who were just 4 and 9 months old when they were kidnapped by Hamas back on the 7th of October 2023. The father of the family, Yardan Bibas, 35 years old, has actually already been released after surviving his time in captivity. What Hamas have been saying for some time now is that Sheri Bibas and her 2 young sons were killed in an Israeli airstrike in the first few months of the conflict in Gaza. That is something that has never actually been officially confirmed by the Israeli military or other Israeli authorities. We've also had a statement from the Bibas family reacting to this announcement from Hamas. They're saying that they are understandably really in turmoil and that they are waiting for definitive confirmation. So I think this case really reflecting what we're seeing now, this shift into a different phase of these hostage releases, not just living hostages being returned to their family and the elation associated with that, but also these families who for some time now have thought that their family members could be deceased, now seeing potentially some confirmation of that.
Giles, Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar said negotiations on the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire will begin this week. We know they have been delayed. How likely is this to happen?
Well, we do expect them to start in the next few days, but actually, even though official negotiations haven't actually started, we do have both sides kind of putting out their initial bargaining positions out into the public arena. Gideon Saar, the foreign minister, saying that they are very committed to this idea about there not being any sort of continued presence for Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, also saying that he is open to, or the Israeli government would be open to, prolonging the current ceasefire if they get towards the beginning of March when it's supposed to expire and they're close to a deal. We've also had Hamas on the other side of this deal saying that they would be prepared under certain circumstances to release all of the remaining Israeli prisoners in one go, rather than these kind of weekly phased releases that we've seen throughout phase one. Just to remind you, under the initial terms of phase two, as was agreed at the start, what we would see is all of the Israeli hostages released by Hamas in exchange for all of the Israeli troops inside Gaza completely withdrawing from the enclave.
Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at the top business news. British inflation increased by more than expected to hit a 10-month high of 3% in January and is likely to rise even further. The Office for National Statistics said the increase was driven largely by a smaller than usual drop in airfares and a rise in fuel prices. Analysts say figures could slow the Bank of England's interest rate cuts. KFC's headquarters is being moved from its ancestral home in Kentucky to Texas as part of a wider shake-up at its parent company. Yum Brands says it will shift the office from Louisville to Plano. However, the fast food giant will keep some operations in Kentucky. In recent years, many companies have relocated to Texas due to the state's lower taxes and business-friendly policies. Turning to the sports news now. Tiger Woods, one of golf's most famous players, left his teammates in fits of laughter after a yardage mix-up during a tournament in California. Woods left himself 199 yards to the hole on the 13th after his tee shot. However, a mix-up with his caddy meant he chose a wedge to hit his shot 99 yards. That left him really short. A confused Woods immediately sought out his caddy and then admitted that was one of the most embarrassing moments in his golfing career. And this evening, we'll see the latest installment of a Champions League rivalry between two of the era's leading teams. Real Madrid will face Manchester City in Spain in the second leg of the knockout playoff, which pits the record 15-time champions of Europe against the 2023 winners. Two of Europe's most successful managers, Carlo Ancelotti and Pep Guardiola, will go head-to-head. Now, a reminder of our top stories. Trump calls Zelenskyy a dictator after refusing to hold elections, accusing him of doing a terrible job. As after Zelenskyy responded to Trump's comments that Ukraine could have settled the war with Russia easily and criticized the US president of being trapped in a disinformation bubble. Meanwhile, Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg arrives in Kyiv to discuss security guarantees as he promises to sit and listen to Ukraine. And Hamas says it will hand over the bodies of 4 hostages on Thursday, including 2 children taken by the group on the 7th of October. That's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Hadley Gamble's interview with Poppy Gustafson, the UK's Minister for State for Investment, is coming up next. Now, that's followed by Riz Khan hosting Keith O'Connell, the former US Director of Space Commerce. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night.